Sure. So the question is, what is third world approaches to international law? And if I was to summarize this, I would say third world approaches to international law consists of a network of scholars who are concerned to ask the question, how can international law be used to further the interests of the people in developing countries? So there has been a long tradition of scholars from the third world over many decades who have been trying to ask this question and find an answer which is appropriate for the particular times in which we live. So in a previous generation, there were scholars from Africa, such as Theo Elias. There were scholars from India, Professor R.P. Anand. What they were concerned about is trying to use international law, which was basically in its modern form constructed by the West. And the question was, how can this Western international law be used to further the interests of people living in developing countries, in other words, the countries that were formerly colonized. So this question is the one question, I think, which unites those great scholars from an earlier generation with the current group of scholars who are now working all over the world, really, trying to answer this simple question. The modern version of third world approaches to international law has been perhaps, you could say, it's been roughly 20 years in operation. The modern version of TWAIL began perhaps in 1997, you could say. And I think the impact has been quite considerable, because more and more people are interested in the work that is being done by TWAIL scholars. I'm here in Colombia to attend a conference dealing with these issues. I've attended conferences in many other countries, recently in Cairo, in Egypt, for instance. We've also held conferences in Canada and various other places. And now the interesting thing is that even mainstream scholarship is taking an interest in what third world approaches to international law scholars are doing. So I think the impact has been quite considerable, and I expect the impact to be extending even further as the years go by. So I do think TWAIL has some important insights to offer on many of these questions. So TWAIL scholars have been working on globalization, for instance. So my colleague B.S. Chimney has written a very interesting article called International Institutions, a Global State in the Making. That article was written in 2002. But if we study that article, we can see he has been amazingly full of foresight in seeing how the international situation has developed. So his basic argument in that article, for instance, is that we should think of the first world and the third world not in terms of different geographical locations, not in terms of the West and the non-West, but in terms of the issue of rich people and poor people. And he could already talk about issues of inequality and the way in which international law generates inequality through various international economic regimes and so forth. That article was written more than 10 years ago. But now we can see already there is a considerable backlash against globalization. Even countries in Europe are developing immense reservations and uncertainties about the effects of globalization. And if we look at that work of Professor Chimney, we can see him writing already about those issues, long before they became such an important and compelling topic for today. So in a similar vein, TWAIL scholarship has written extensively on international investment regimes, for instance. And so I can think of another TWAIL scholar, Professor Swarnaraja. Something like 30 years ago, even before the investment regime properly began to develop, he said that this is a very problematic regime. And now events seem to be showing that he is very acutely correct in that regard. So the interesting thing that is happening now is that problems that were usually located only in the third world 20 or 30 years ago are now problems that we find in the West and in America as well. So in other words, there is a third world in these rich countries. And so TWAIL has already developed the analytical skills that would help us understand those things. So what is interesting now is that there's a reversal taking place, that there's a power shift taking place. Some Asian countries are going to become very rich and powerful, such as China. And in the same way, there are certain countries which were previously rich, which are going to be in a more difficult position. And what we see is that in many ways, the third world condition has become a global condition. That in virtually all countries, we can see these inequalities and various forms of dispossession taking place. And TWAIL scholarship has already provided a set of analytical tools to try and understand those issues. So TWAIL scholarship deals with virtually every aspect of modern international law. So there are 12 scholars who have written on international environmental law, on international criminal law, on international investment law, on international trade law, on international institutions. And so there's a TWAIL position that has been developed in relation to all these issues. And fortunately, or somewhat unfortunately, that scholarship, I think, is very useful in terms of understanding the developments that are taking place now. Because that scholarship suggested many years ago that inequality is going to continue. And that is what is happening in the modern world. And we can also see the way in which environmental degradation is continuing. And so these are all issues that in various ways TWAIL scholars have been trying to address. And if you look at an earlier generation of TWAIL scholars like Judge Veeramantri, Christopher Veeramantri, who was a judge on the International Court of Justice, we can see the relevance of his writings on issues such as sustainable development. Because if we don't formulate an effective set of policies in relation to environmental issues, then it's difficult to know how we are going to survive as a species. See that going back to what I mentioned earlier, TWAIL talked about issues of inequality and marginalization. And those issues in a previous time were issues that were only faced in developing countries, in poor countries. Now, what we see is that all these problems are also very much a part of the situation that Western countries are confronting. And they face a real challenge and confusion in knowing how to respond to these issues. And we can also see, going back to what I mentioned about how countries that were previously poor are now very rich. So we can see this interesting complication, isn't it, about how very rich billionaires from the Middle East and China are buying up huge, properties in very valuable properties in London, so that local people can't live in their own city. And we can see, similar complications in various other rich countries. So we find that the people who are accustomed to good standards of living are themselves now being affected in various ways, and they don't know what sort of solution to find in these types of circumstances. So I think historically it has been shown that at a time of great economic uncertainty and hardship, people resort to very basic approaches and instincts. So it's happened time and time again, where in a time of great economic hardship and inequality, somebody comes and says, I am the solution. I can solve this problem. I'll get rid of all the foreigners. It has happened time and time again historically. And the interesting thing is that it is now happening in Europe, and it is now happening in the United States.